I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, front page stories like this one in the Jewish Week heralding a huge moment for advocates of Orthodox women rabbis. The substance of the story in the Jewish Week, written by its editor and publisher Gary Rosenblatt, deals with Rabbi Shlomo Riskin's stepping down from his leadership role of Or Torah Stone Institutions, a major educational initiative Shlomo Riskin started in Israel, which bestows upon women the equivalent of rabbinic ordination. And as Shlomo Riskin steps aside, he is now 77 years old and continues as the founding chief rabbi of Efrat, Israel. His successor will be Rabbi Kenneth Brander, a leading figure in the Open Orthodoxy wing of Orthodox Judaism. Kenneth Brander has had an extremely successful pulpit in Florida's Boca Raton Synagogue, and then came to Yeshiva University here in New York, where he served as vice president for university and community life and taught rabbinics at YU's Rabbinical School. Now, the fact that Kenneth Brander will be succeeding Shlomo Riskin as the dean of Or Torah Stone Institutions is seen as strengthening the notion that within mainstream Orthodoxy, women should now have a legitimate halachic role in matters of determining Jewish law, in teaching positions, and in other positions of leadership. Well, how do Orthodox Jewish groups who consider themselves to be mainstream, authentic expressions of Judaism, view the role of women in Orthodox Jewish life today, and do they feel that the Riskin-Brander perspective on women, embodied in Or Torah institutions, or in Avi Weiss's rabbinical school here in America, Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, is in fact a sign of a significant evolution of mainstream Orthodoxy? For some answers, I am so pleased to welcome back to JBS the Director of Public Affairs for Agudath Israel of America and one of the most articulate and thoughtful voices on the American Jewish scene today, as well as being a lovely individual, Rabbi Avi Shafran. Avi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark, for having me and for those over-the-top kind remarks.
All true.
I'm not pleading guilty.
All true. By the way, first of all, Shana Tova for this new Jewish year. I hope it is a sweet, healthy year for you and all whom you love, and that you continue to do the fabulous work you're doing at Agudath Israel.
Amen. And the same to you and your listeners.
Thank you. Okay, so Avi, how do you respond to the notion that mainstream Orthodoxy is moving towards empowering women in matters of halakha, Jewish law?
I don't subscribe to it at all, at least if one's talking about the rabbinate, which is what most of the discussion's about. There's no question that women are much more prominent in the Orthodox community than perhaps they were 100 years ago or even 50 years ago. But there's always been a strong undercurrent of the fact that women in Orthodoxy have always played a very pivotal role in the development of the community, obviously in the education of the Jewish families, which is where the most important education is done, not in schools but in the home, and in institutions as well, whether they be seminaries or they be Beit Yaakovs, the high schools and day schools across the country. That Jewish women, for the most part, are the instructors and the guides of the students. Where it gets a little sticky is whether a title like rabbi or cleric of some other sort is appropriate for a woman in Orthodoxy. And even though some of the people that you mentioned feel that it's time for that to happen, I don't think it's fair or accurate to say that there's a movement within mainstream Orthodoxy in that direction.
Mm-hmm. By the way, are you offended by either Or Torah Stone Institutions or Yeshivat Chovevei Torah because they do take a different view on women than you do?
I'm not offended, but I don't consider them, frankly, at least I'm more familiar with Yeshivat Chovevei Torah than I am with our Torah Stone institutions, I don't believe that they really have a credible claim to being part of Orthodoxy, much less mainstream Orthodoxy. And the reason for that, I don't mean it as a harsh judgment. I simply mean it as a factual one, based on the fact that, and I've asked people from that institution to differentiate their approach to halakha, to Jewish religious law, from that of the conservative movement of the 50s and 60s of the previous century.
And what do they say?
They're at a loss for words, because even though they don't consider themselves to be conservative Jews, or their movement to be a neo-conservative movement, in effect, the things that they champion, which are utilizing ideals and the zeitgeist of the contemporary world as guides for where halakha needs to go, that's something that is inherently a conservative Judaism approach to halakha, or at least it was then. And in Orthodoxy, that's just not the way that Orthodoxy has ever worked throughout history, and therefore I would sooner call them, again, without insult, simply as a more accurate factual title, neo-conservative rather than modern or open Orthodox. It's not really Orthodoxy if it looks to the outside world for guidance regarding where Jewish law should go and how Jews should comport themselves.
Okay, what you're saying now is fascinating, and there's subtlety to it and nuance to it. In the time we have, I want to touch on it. It really belongs in a discussion here on L'chaim in person. But within the conservative movement, also within the Reform movement, but let's stick with conservative Judaism at the moment and JTS. The perspective they would argue is that they're not using the values of the New York Times to shape their Judaism, that they are in fact looking at the Jewish tradition, both the values inherent in the Jewish tradition, as well as examples of Jewish law, literal Jewish law. And, Avi, there's more than one very famous passage in accepted Jewish literature, one by Maimonides, who basically says it is incumbent upon the Jew to learn from the best of the society in which Jews find themselves. That there is a distinction between, in essence, avodah zarah, some kind of idolatrous view that pervades a secular or general society, but there's also a sense that there can be Torah, even within the secular world, and that Jews have a responsibility to learn from the best of the society around them, and not to act as if nothing can penetrate from the outside world. So the conservative movement would answer you. Number one, they would say, we do look to the Jewish tradition for our value system. And number two, if we do at times learn from the greater world, it is only within a Jewish context that we do so. So if they were here, how would you answer it?
Well, I think it's pretty clear from the history of the movement that it capitulated to societal forces that at one time it swore off without any reservation. It was probably, I think it was in the year 2000, I wrote an article that caused a big ruckus, mainly because of the title that the magazine put on it, which was not my title, about the conservative movements, about the veracity of what you've just described very eloquently.
What was the title, Avi?
The title that they gave it was The Conservative Lie.
Mm-hmm.
The title I gave it was Time to Come Home.
Okay.
And when I protested, when they sent me the proofs of it, and I protested vehemently, they refused to listen to me. It was Moment Magazine. I think it was the year 2000.
Well, good
but be that as it may, the bottom line was that it was a very reasoned and footnoted and clearly articulated exposing of the fact that even though the conservative movement had taken very strong positions about halakhic matters at one point, that they buckled when society went a certain way, and I even predicted that they would buckle further on things that at the time they were not yet, they hadn't given in yet. namely with regard to gay marriage and things and homosexuality in general. And even intermarriage, and on those issues, there has been tremendous movement, precisely in the direction that I said there would be. When you can predict a movement's future stances based on nothing more than societal mores that are not all going to be in consonance with the Torah ideals, and you're 100% right that the ones that are wise and are proper and are in consonance with Judaism, we must recognize, as the Talmud puts it, that yesh chachma bagoyim, there is wisdom in the nations. But judging which societal mores are wise and which ones are not is not something that can be done in a haphazard way, and certainly they're not things that should be all accepted entirely and then justified after the fact, which is what I do believe the conservative movement has done over the years. And it's something that I believe that the so-called Open Orthodox movement is doing as well. I just want honesty in truth in advertising, so to speak. If what's going to determine the attitude toward issues X, Y, and Z is what the world thinks about that at a particular point in human history, then I don't think that can be squared with the concept of orthodoxy, which, while it does understand there's wisdom in the world, is very conservative, lowercase c, with regard to judging which things are proper to access and which things are dangerous to access.
Okay. In some way, I feel, in all honesty, if I describe the American scene in an academic setting, and I'm talking about conservative Judaism, it seems to me there were two pivotal moments in conservative Jewish life. One was when the conservative movement changed its position on members being permitted to drive on the Shabbat, in theory, only from their homes to the synagogue. This was in suburbs where conservative Jews were not living close enough to walk to a synagogue, and the conservative movement made an accommodation, saying that if you drove a car to the synagogue, that was permissible, but you should not do any other driving on Shabbat. In some way, that was a major chink in the conservative movement's commitment to halakha. The greater one came when there was the decision by JTS to accept women rabbis. And people who remember this in the late 70s, early 80s, the JTS had a vote, and the Committee on Law and Standards of JTS voted against admitting women for ordination, and they wrote a long, very scholarly work explaining why halakha does not permit women rabbis. The conservative laity was up in arms because the Reform movement was already ordaining women, and there were many in the conservative movement who said, if my synagogue is not going to accept women, then I'm going to simply move to a Reform synagogue. And by the way, there's no conservative rabbi here or no member of JTS to say that I've got it wrong. But I believe what I'm describing is historically accurate. I do
believe there were two camps, though, I think, among the
rabbis. That is correct. One camp, by the way, remained adamant within JTS that halakha does not accept women, should not accept women candidates. And when a second vote was taken, and lo and behold, in the second vote, it was determined that women should be permitted to become candidates for the rabbinical school at JTS, that other group broke off and remained what they considered to be authentic conservative Judaism as opposed to what they felt JTS was moving. I quote that in this conversation because I want you and I want our viewers to understand I am sensitive to the tensions that the Jewish community has always dealt with between accommodating or developing or evolving, as Mordechai Kaplan would have used the term, an evolving civilization, and at the same time a traditional Orthodox perspective that the law is the law. I appreciate what you're saying, But then I want to ask you to comment on what is often quoted as examples of Orthodox evolution. And you use the word that Conservative Judaism buckled. Buckled is a pejorative, as opposed to saying that how Conservative Judaism or how Orthodox Judaism has evolved. And I believe those who are part of or Torah Stone institutions or Chovevei Torah, they would argue they weren't buckling, Avi. They were evolving in a tradition that has halachic principle already. So, for example, even leaving aside the prose bull, which is always quoted, and I'm hoping those of you in the audience who knows what the prose bull is and how the prose bull was an evolution of Jewish law, you'll deal with it on your own. But there were the takanot of Reb Gershom, in which halacha changed on whether a Jew could have more than one wife, where halacha changed on matters of divorce and a woman's right to participate in the decision of divorce, and on the matter of whether adultery was in fact a capital crime or not. All of these were changed at a specific point in time within it wasn't Orthodoxy then, because the Orthodox, everything was traditional. The people believe the word Orthodox goes back a long way. The term Orthodox is really a reaction to Conservative Reform Judaism. But in terms of mainstream Judaism, the law did evolve at given points in time within the traditional community. And the conservative rabbi or the conservative movement or what's called now open orthodoxy, in a conversation with you, they would quote things of this nature to say that there is an evolutionary process that has an authenticity even within mainstream Judaism, mainstream orthodoxy.
Absolutely.
How would you respond?
I would never deny that. And the reason I use the word buckle is simply because if something is done in response to pressure from either one's congregants or the zeitgeist, the
yes.
spirit of the times.
Yes.
So I consider that to be not necessarily evolutionary, though it could be, but in many cases, and I believe that in the conservative case, it's more accurately characterized as a succumbing to pressure. And buckled is simply, to me at least, a way of shortening that succumbing to pressure word. I didn't mean it as a pejorative, again, as a descriptive. And there's no question that you're right, that there have been evolutions within orthodoxy, most of which, the vast majority of which have been stringencies, I have to note, not permissions. Very, very rare is there a permission granted. When Rabbeinu Gershom forbade, and he didn't say it was a halacha, he simply said it's a takana, which is a different thing, which is a societal need. When he forbade multiple wives, that was a restriction, not a permission.
Yes.
And the prose bowl was a legal loophole, much as when we sell our chametz for Pesach. But let's not get into that. I wrote a recent piece for the Forward. It just appeared today about women rabbis. And I spent many paragraphs explaining that there is a tremendous precedent in with regards to Jewish women in the establishment of the Beit Yaakov movement. Mm-hmm. Sarah Shanira was a Polish rabbi's daughter, and she saw that the women of her time were becoming ignorant of Jewish law and Jewish life. And she was mocked for her advocacy for women's Jewish education, but in the end, she won out. She got various rabbis to give her an imprimatur to establish these schools, and now they're part and parcel of the entire Orthodox world. So there definitely is a precedent for evolution with regards to women's roles and what women should be and should not be doing. Again, the question simply is an evolutionary change, is a quantum leap toward women as clergy in Judaism, is that something whose time has come, or whose time might come in the future but not now, or whose time might never come? And for that, we go to the Orthodox Union, for instance, which is not a right-wing organization, went to its religious lights and guides and they put out a multi-page responsum about it, where they acknowledged the importance of women and various changes in women's roles, but they stopped short and were very clear about the fact that that doesn't extend at this point to women clergy. And the Rabbinical Council of America has a similar approach to the whole idea of what we called open orthodoxy before, and they won't accept in their Orthodox rabbinical group, which is what they are, someone who comes based with a ordination that comes from Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. So there are changes that are proper, there are evolutions that are real and right, and then there are those that are not. And the rub lies in distinguishing between the two. And mainstream orthodoxy, which I think one can characterize without any question as including groups like the Orthodox Union, groups like the one that I represent, Agudath Israel of America, and certainly other Hasidic groups and whatnot, I think that mainstream orthodoxy has been very clear about the fact that what's called evolutionary changes that institutions like YCT or like Rabbi Weiss has championed, changes like that are simply not within the boundaries of Orthodox Judaism. Mm-hmm. Again, it's a judgment. There's no name calling here, there's no rancor here, there's no ill will, but one has to stand up for one's principles, and the principles of those mainstream Orthodox institutions are what they are, and that's what they are.
Okay. As far as I know, even in synagogues that consider them to be open Orthodox synagogues, women are not called to the Torah. They may be a women's minyan, but they're not called to the Torah. From your perspective, is there anything inappropriate if a congregation wishes to call women to the Torah based on the Talmudic passage in Megillah that says specifically women are permitted to read from the Torah unless doing so violates the dignity of the community, the dignity of the congregation? If there were an Orthodox congregation, an Orthodox community, Avi, which did not feel its dignity was in any way being violated by calling a woman to the Torah, would you acknowledge that halakha permits a woman to receive an aliyah?
Well, I don't believe that the Talmud says what you quoted. It's saying it doesn't allow for it, and it makes a value judgment that it is a lack of respect for a congregation for women to have a public role with regard to reading the Torah. It doesn't leave it up to a particular congregation to make a decision on its own. It states it as a bold fact. It's a fact that needs explanation, obviously, though I think it can easily be understood, even in our tremendously feminist and woman-centered times, in the debasement, like we've seen in recent days, debasement has come to light of women, that we haven't come very far as a species with regard to how women are treated by many men. It's not that we are insulted by women in certain roles, but that rather women are debased by society in certain ways, and that has an an impact on the halachic question of whether they should be put before a congregation in a public way, and like reading the Torah. It's a complicated and very, very sensitive. It needs sensitivity to understand, but I don't think that the Talmud allows for any wiggle room on that, and therefore I would say that if a congregation does allow women to read from the Torah, that it's inherently not a halachic conversation. It's not a halachic congregation. It's one that is, as I say, as I characterized it before, neoconservative or some other movement name that we can make up. But it's not what the world has known as orthodoxy since the term was coined.
Well, I think you're right that in terms of the social development of what Orthodox Judaism has been and is today, that you're correct to say that in an Orthodox congregation, it wouldn't be done. And I say this very humbly. I am not the scholar you are, Avi, but I believe you are not quoting Megillah correctly. That Megillah begins by delineating all those who are permitted to read from the Torah. And in the list of those who are permitted, in Tractate Megillah, women are included. And then it says, unless it is in some way a violation of Kibud Tzibur, that somehow the honor of the congregation is offended. In that case, Megillah says, a women would not be called to the Torah. And my question to you was, could you imagine an Orthodox synagogue in which there was a community where they did not feel it was in any way a violation of kibbutz tzibur for them? And if that were true, the specific statement in Megillah, which delineates those who may be called to the Torah, including women, would you have an objection in that Orthodox synagogue if women did receive an aliyah?
Well, as I say, my recollection of the Talmud, and certainly and I can say this with surety, because I don't have a copy of Megillah in front of me, but I can say with surety that the halachic development post-Talmudic times has certainly taken on that opinion, if it's only an opinion, or that global statement, which is how I recall it, that kavod hatzibur is somehow lessened by having women in prominent roles. There's no question in my mind that all the halachic literature since the Talmud has been very clear that that is indeed the position of halakha. So, whether or not your recollection of the Talmudic passage or mine is the more accurate one, and that can easily be looked up, the bottom line has nothing to do with what the Talmud says. It has to do with the development of halakha from the Talmud, which is what Orthodoxy relies upon.
Okay, I understand.
The whole philosophy is based on that.
I understand. So, my last question sort of brings me back to the beginning. There is now in Orthodoxy, obviously, a move to include women in ways that mainstream Orthodoxy, as you understand it, simply would never do. Is there something you can say about how you feel the existence of open Orthodoxy, what it means for the Jewish community today? Is there anything about open Orthodoxy and the fact that it does appeal to and make Jewish life possible for a certain segment of the American Jewish population? Is there anything of value to you in that expression of Judaism?
That's a hard question to answer because every expression of Jewish ideals can always be a portal for people to come to what I consider to be the authentic form of Judaism, which is halachic respecting Judaism. On the other hand, one does have to be clear about what is and what is not consonant with halachic Judaism, and I don't believe that a congregation or an institution, no matter what it calls itself, is in consonance with that if it takes its guidance from willy-nilly from societal changes. And I do believe that that's what open Orthodoxy has been doing. And I think it's evident in the words of many of its graduates, which are easily. There's a whole book that was written about these digressions from halacha. The title of it escapes me at the moment. Oh yes, I do remember. It's called "Why Open Orthodoxy Is Not Orthodox." It's a book that's written by a young scholar, and he simply researched the official statements and positions of open Orthodoxy and the statements of many of its graduates. And I think the case is an open and shut case. There's no wiggle room there. That it is not an Orthodox movement if one defines Orthodoxy as commitment above all to the halachic approach and to how halacha evolves. Again, it does evolve, but it doesn't evolve willy-nilly. It doesn't evolve without great care and inspection and great people doing the evolving. We don't have a Rabbeinu Gershom today. We don't have a Rambam today. But we have who we have today, and there are great halachic scholars today, none of whom have bought into the open Orthodoxy approach or that of the Conservative Reform movement. I don't in any sense debase any Jew for following his or her lights. But at the same time, I do believe that there's something called the Jewish religious tradition, and that's what we champion here in the so-called right-wing Orthodox world.
Okay. I'll say again, I appreciate you so much. And you're very lovely to come on JBS and let me push you the way I do. And you always are
That's why I come on, Mark, because
you're-
I appreciate the back and forth and the respect and the goodwill that I think should inform every Jewish interaction, and unfortunately does not.
Amen v'amen. Shana tova mituka. You have a wonderful, healthy, sweet new year. We will speak often.
To you and yours as well, and all the viewers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Rabbi Avi Shafran, Director of Public Affairs for Agudath Israel of America. My thanks as always to our Director Sloan Copeland, Production Coordinator Serge Goldberg, JBS's Associate Director Dara Golub, Editors John McDevitt and Cordelia Siporin, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.